Evil grandpa steals from Grandkids trust fund, son takes brutal revenge by bankrupting him. Me, 38F, and my husband Jim, 41M, have been happily married for 12 years. We have two wonderful kids, Samantha, 10F, and Michael, 7M. About 5 years ago, Jim's estranged father Frank, 67M, re-entered our lives after being absent for over 20 years. Frank is a wealthy businessman who made his fortune through some shady real estate dealings back in the day. He's a narcissistic, controlling man who always needs to be the center of attention. When Jim was a kid, Frank was physically and emotionally abusive towards him and Jim's mom before she passed away. After re-establishing contact, Frank tried to buy his way back into Jim's life by offering lavish gifts and promises of inheritance. Jim was hesitant at first but eventually decided to give his dad another chance for the sake of the kids having a grandfather figure. At first, things seemed to be going well. Frank doted on the grandkids and even set up trust funds for their college education. However, it soon became clear that his generosity came with strings attached. Frank started imposing his outdated values on our family, criticizing how we raised the kids. He would make snide comments about me working and not being a traditional stay-at-home mom. If the kids misbehaved even a little, he'd demean us as incompetent parents. Worse, he continued his emotionally abusive behavior towards Jim, constantly berating him, bringing up past failures, and gaslighting him into doubting his own recollections of Frank's cruelty when he was young. We tried setting boundaries, but the old man just couldn't respect them. Any disagreement would trigger his rage. It got to the point where I dreaded his visits, seeing the light slowly dim in Jim's eyes as his father tore him down. Then about 6 months ago, things took an even darker turn. I stumbled upon some documents that revealed Frank had been funneling money from the kids' trust funds into his own accounts. He had slowly been siphoning off tens of thousands meant for Samantha and Michael's education. When I showed Jim the evidence, he was devastated but not entirely surprised given his father's history of cruelty and deception. We knew we had to cut Frank out of our lives for good this time. But Jim was also furious at the thought of that bastard getting away with stealing from his own grandchildren. He wanted payback, to hit Frank where it really hurt. Over the next few weeks, Jim pored over Frank's financial records looking for any vulnerabilities to exploit. He discovered that a good chunk of the old man's net worth was tied up in a large real estate development deal he was working on. If we could find a way to sabotage that deal and make Frank's investment go belly up, it would enact the ultimate humiliation on him, depriving him of his wealth and status. It was risky, but Jim was determined to make his dad suffer. Our plan was simple yet effective in its psychological warfare. First, we filed reports with the IRS documenting the fund transfers from the kids' trusts as unambiguous tax fraud on Frank's part. This would likely result in hefty fines and years of audits down the line. But we didn't stop there. We invited Frank over under the pretense of having a family discussion. When he arrived, I laid out the evidence of his theft right in front of him, furious tears in my eyes at his betrayal. Frank just smirked arrogantly and said, "What are you gonna do about it?" That's when Jim hit him with the bombshell. We had already reported him to the IRS and SEC for the trust fund scheme. His empire was about to face intense scrutiny. The old man's face drained of color. He became unhinged, screaming obscenities at us and attempting to lunge at Jim before I stepped between them. As Frank raged impotently, Jim stayed calm and coldly declared that this was just the beginning of his payback. When Frank somewhat regained his composure, Jim laid out the rest of our plan to bring him down a notch. He revealed he had obtained sensitive information about Frank's big real estate deal, insider information the old man had illegally obtained through backroom bribes. Jim made it clear that if Frank didn't start making amends by returning every penny he stole from the kids, plus interest, he would release the incriminating evidence to the authorities and Frank's investors. A deal that crooked and relying so much on fraud would quickly collapse without the cover-up. Frank turned ghostly white. His entire life's work, all the wealth and status he had clawed his way towards through underhanded tactics, now teetered on the brink because of his own greed. For once, his abusive bluster faded as the reality sank in. Outnumbered and losing his usual air of intimidating bravado, Frank had no choice but to negotiate. He angrily agreed to replenish the missing funds from the kids' trusts within a month, including interest. But that wasn't enough for Jim. "You're also going to sign over power of attorney to me for all your assets, effective immediately," he stated coldly. "Consider it insurance that you won't retaliate or try any more schemes once this is over." Frank looked like he was about to have an aneurysm. Handing over legal control of his empire was a total emasculation, a fate worse than death for a malignant narcissist like him. But the fire had finally gone out of his eyes. Beaten, He stiffly nodded in grim acquiescence of our demands. As Frank slumped on the couch stunned, crushed by having his own twisted tactics used against him, Jim leaned in close. "This is what you get for underestimating your own son and stealing from your grandkids. Maybe next time you'll think twice before being such a manipulative, egocentric prick." I could see decades of pent-up anger and resentment bubbling to the surface. Jim pulled out the power of attorney contract, slamming it down on the table in front of Frank. "Sign it. Now." With a shaking hand, Frank took the pen and scribbled his name, legally ceding control of his fortune to Jim. The man who derived his entire sense of self-worth from money and power was now utterly defeated. For the next month, we kept Frank on a very tight leash. He had no choice but to comply with wiring over $180,000 to refortify the trust funds he had plundered from our kids. Any attempt at regaining leverage was swiftly cut off by threats of releasing the real estate corruption evidence. Meanwhile, Jim took great delight in exercising his power of attorney. He began strategically liquidating some of Frank's more excessive and frivolous assets, his vacation homes, his yacht, his car collection. All while leaving the prudent investments and business dealings relatively untouched so as not to risk cratering the old man's net worth entirely. It was psychological torment, depriving Frank of his cherished status symbols one by one. Every attempt to plead or bargain with Jim was met with stony silence or outright mockery. For once, the abusive bully was utterly impotent. Things only got worse for Frank when the IRS came knocking a few weeks later. Agents grilled him for hours upon reviewing our documentation about the illicit transfers from the Grandkids trust funds. He sputtered and fumed throughout, but could offer no reasonable defense for the blatant fraud. In the end, Frank was slapped with over $300,000 in fees, penalties, and accrued back taxes. The investigation also promised to be ongoing, with his finances and business dealings facing years of scrutiny going forward. I could barely suppress my glee seeing that arrogant prick be taken down more than a few pegs. And Jim reveled in having total control over his father's diminishing assets and legacy, a gleam of sadistic satisfaction in his eyes. For months, the emotional torture persisted. Jim made it a daily routine to call Frank and berate him for his failures as a father and human being. He'd robotically list off whatever assets were being sold off that week and mock Frank's impotent rage. "How does it feel to have zero control? To be utterly powerless while everything you spent your life building gets picked apart?" Jim would taunt with relish. "This is a taste of the helplessness and shame I felt as your victim all those years." At one point, seeing the old man utterly broken and in tears, Jim forced Frank to start updating his will to reflect permanent revisions, namely cutting out any inheritance for extended family in favor of just Samantha and Michael receiving his estate after his death. With each ounce of dignity and legacy chipped away, Frank grew increasingly disconsolate. Once such a blustering tyrant, he was now a shrunken, haggard husk. Anytime he tried to protest or threaten retaliation, Jim need only dangle the prospect of exposing his real estate misdeeds to shut him up. Ultimately, Jim opted not to go through with leaking the real estate corruption evidence, keeping that threat as an eternal sword over Frank's head. There was a form of sick pleasure in allowing the old vulture to keep that shady development deal as his sole remaining prized possession. However, Jim did coordinate with the trust fund officials to have permanent safeguards put in place. From now on, any money meant for the Grandkids would be scrutinized and triple verified to prevent it from being plundered again. On the legal front, while Frank was able to avoid doing real prison time thanks to his expensive lawyers, he was still utterly bled dry from the crippling IRS penalties, fees, and repayment of funds. His net worth shrank by about 60% overnight. And of course, he fully remained under Jim's control via the power of attorney arrangement. An ungodly amount of money got tied up in legal funds just to sort out revising asset distributions and wills per Jim's edicts. For 2 straight years after that fateful confrontation, Jim milked the power of attorney for all it was worth. He strategically picked apart Frank's asset portfolio, repeatedly selling off homes, businesses, and liquidating anything frivolous. All the while, I could see the malicious glee in Jim's eyes as he meticulously bled his father dry. It was a form of cleanup, closing out all the shady income streams Frank had relied on throughout his life through crooked schemes and exploitation. With each sell-off, the old man grew more haggard and despondent, his spirit utterly crushed. Any attempt at regaining leverage was swiftly torpedoed by reminders of the remaining real estate evidence that could still sink him. Frank's fortune gradually divested down to just a handful of relatively legitimate holdings. Jim made it clear these were the only assets that would eventually pass to Samantha and Michael when the time came. Everything else was systematically burned to the ground. In the aftermath, Our family's emotional healing process was a long one. There were still good days and bad days as Jim processed the decades of trauma inflicted by his monstrously abusive father. But I could see the weight lifting off his shoulders with each purging of Frank's ill-gotten toxic assets. For so long, those had remained as reminders of the old man's exploitation and cruelty. Dismantling them piece by piece was cathartic in its own way, like shedding psychological shackles. No longer would our kids potentially inherit any part of their grandfather's nefarious legacy. Samantha and Michael did struggle with some conflicting feelings. They loved Frank at times despite his faults, but once they reached an age to understand the full extent of his betrayal, the theft from their trust funds cemented their anger. These days, Jim has zero contact with Frank and it will likely stay that way until the bitter end. The old man is still around, living off the relatively meager legitimate holdings that escaped liquidation. But he's a wizened, hollow shell, the life slowly draining out of his eyes with each passing year. I know making Frank's life a protracted, emotionally tormenting hell until the day he dies may seem extreme. And perhaps it was an act of cold vengeance that brought Jim perilously close to mirroring some of his father's cruelty and narcissism. But I also witnessed firsthand the multi-generational cycle of abuse Frank perpetuated. The deep psychological scars he inflicted on not just Jim, but me and the kids as well through his toxic, demeaning presence in our lives. His greed and entitlement very nearly robbed our own children of opportunities. In that light, while the revenge was utterly nuclear in its scope, it was also utterly justified in dismantling Frank's wealth and power bit by bit, neutralizing his ability to inflict further trauma or inheritance of his moral sickness to the next generation. At his core, Jim simply did what he had to in order to permanently extricate this cancerous influence from our family's life. He may have gotten a little too much sick satisfaction out of watching his father's downfall at times. But after enduring decades of torment himself, I can't blame him. Frank's remaining years on Earth will be ones of nullity devoid of importance or legacy. A sad, impotent coda for a miserable bully who so richly deserves such an inglorious ending to reap what he'd mercilessly sown. Break Story 2. Me, 32F, and my husband, 34M, have been together for 8 years, married for 5. We have a beautiful 3-year-old daughter, and up until recently, I thought we had a pretty solid, happy family life. My husband, let's call him Jake, is a hard-working accountant, while I'm a stay-at-home mom, taking care of our little girl in the household. My in-laws, however, have always been a bit of a sore spot in our relationship. Jake's mother, Sophia, 60F, is a controlling, manipulative woman who has never really approved of me. She constantly criticizes my parenting skills, my appearance, and the way I run our household. Jake's father, Robert, 62M, is more passive but often enables Sophia's behavior. Things came to a head a few months ago when Sophia insisted on helping with our daughter's 3rd birthday party. I had everything planned out, a simple backyard party with a few of her friends and their parents, but Sophia took over, insisting on hiring an expensive catering company, renting a bouncy castle, and inviting half the neighborhood, all without consulting me. When I tried to politely voice my concerns, Sophia accused me of being ungrateful and not wanting the best for my daughter. Jake, as usual, didn't stand up for me, saying his mother was just trying to help. The party was a lavish, over-the-top affair that left me feeling overwhelmed and disrespected in my own home. A few weeks after the disastrous birthday party, I noticed that our dog, a lovable golden retriever named Buddy, was acting a bit off. He seemed lethargic and wasn't eating as much as usual. I took him to the vet, and that's when the bombshell dropped. Buddy had been poisoned with chocolate, which is highly toxic to dogs. The vet was able to stabilize him, but it was a close call. I was distraught. Who would want to harm such a sweet, gentle dog? And then it hit me, the only people who had been to our house recently were Jake's parents, when they came over for our daughter's birthday party. I confronted Jake about my suspicions, but he brushed me off, saying I was overreacting and that his parents would never do something like that. But deep down, I knew it had to be them. Sophia had always disliked Buddy, claiming he was a nuisance and that we shouldn't have pets around our daughter. I decided to do some digging, and sure enough, I found security camera footage from our backyard that showed Sophia dropping something into Buddy's water bowl when no one was looking. I was devastated and furious. How could someone be so cruel, especially to an innocent animal? I wasted no time in confronting Sophia and Robert. With the incriminating video evidence in hand, I invited them over under the guise of a family dinner. When they arrived, I played the footage for them, and Sophia's reaction was chilling. She didn't even try to deny it. "That mutt was a menace," she spat. "He was always underfoot, and I was worried he might hurt my granddaughter. I did what any good mother would do, I protected my family. Robert just sat there, silent and ashamed, as usual. Jake tried to defend his parents, saying they were just concerned for our daughter's safety, but I was having none of it. I demanded that they leave our house immediately and warned them that if they ever came near our family or Buddy again, I wouldn't hesitate to involve the authorities. In the following days, Jake and I had some heated arguments. He couldn't understand why I was so upset, saying that his mother was just being overprotective and that Buddy was fine now. I was appalled at his lack of empathy and his blind loyalty to his parents, even after they had committed such a heinous act. "She could have killed our dog, Jake," I shouted, tears streaming down my face. "And what if our daughter had been the one to accidentally ingest the chocolate? Your mother is unstable and dangerous." Jake tried to placate me, saying we should just move on and forget about the whole thing, but I knew I couldn't let it go. Sophia's actions had crossed a line, and I feared for our family's safety as long as she was in our lives. In the following weeks, the tension between Jake and me only grew. Sophia and Robert tried to reach out to us, but I refused to take their calls or see them. Jake, on the other hand, continued to maintain contact with them behind my back, which only added to my feelings of betrayal. One day, I caught him on the phone with his mother, and I lost it. "How can you keep talking to that woman after what she did?" I demanded. "She tried to kill our beloved pet, and you're acting like it's no big deal." Jake tried to reason with me, saying that cutting off his parents completely was an overreaction, but I wasn't having it. I gave him an ultimatum: it was either them or me and our daughter. He had to choose which family he wanted to prioritize. To my utter dismay, Jake chose his parents. He said that while he didn't condone what his mother had done, he couldn't just abandon his family of origin. I was heartbroken and furious. How could he prioritize the people who had tried to harm our pet, our family member, over his own wife and child? I packed my bags and took our daughter, along with Buddy, to stay with my sister for a few days. I needed space to think and to figure out what my next steps would be. Jake begged me to come back, but I couldn't even look at him without feeling an overwhelming sense of betrayal and disappointment. After a few days of staying with my sister, I decided to take legal action against Sophia. I contacted a lawyer and filed a report with the police, providing them with the video evidence of her poisoning Buddy. The lawyer advised me to also file for an emergency restraining order against Sophia and Robert, citing potential danger to myself, my daughter, and our pet. Jake was livid when he found out what I had done. He accused me of overreacting and trying to tear his family apart. "You're blowing this whole thing out of proportion," he shouted. "My mother made a mistake, but she would never intentionally hurt our daughter or you." I couldn't believe his willful ignorance. Didn't he see how unstable and vindictive his mother was? I knew then that our marriage was in serious trouble, but I had to prioritize the safety of my child and myself. The legal proceedings against Sophia moved forward quickly. The judge granted the temporary restraining order, forbidding her and Robert from coming within 500 feet of our home, my sister's place, or my daughter's daycare. Sophia was also charged with animal cruelty, a felony offense. Jake was adamant that I was overreacting and that I should drop the charges. "Think of what this will do to our family," he pleaded. "My parents will be devastated, and your actions will only drive a further wedge between us." But I stood my ground. Sophia had made her choices, and now she had to face the consequences. I couldn't let her get away with what she had done, not when the safety of my loved ones was at stake. As the legal battle raged on, the strain on my marriage became unbearable. Jake and I could barely have a civil conversation without it devolving into a shouting match. He accused me of being vindictive and petty, while I saw his refusal to acknowledge his mother's actions as a betrayal of our family. Things came to a head when Sophia's lawyer tried to argue that the video evidence was inadmissible due to privacy concerns. I was beside myself with rage. They were trying to let her off scot-free, using legal loopholes to avoid taking responsibility. That night, Jake and I had our worst fight yet. He called me obsessed and delusional, saying I was ruining our lives over a stupid dog. I couldn't believe the words coming out of his mouth. It was like he didn't even recognize the gravity of his mother's actions anymore. In the end, the judge ruled in our favor. The video evidence was deemed admissible, and Sophia was found guilty of animal cruelty. She was sentenced to 6 months in county jail and ordered to pay a hefty fine, as well as restitution for Buddy's veterinary bills. While I was relieved that justice had been served, the legal battle had taken an immense toll on our family. Jake was furious with me, blaming me for tearing his family apart. He refused to speak to me unless absolutely necessary and spent most of his time holed up in his home office or staying late at work. Our daughter, who was too young to fully understand what was happening, could sense the tension between us. She became clingy and anxious, often bursting into tears for no apparent reason. It broke my heart to see her so distressed, and I knew I had to do something to try and repair the damage that had been done. In the aftermath of the legal proceedings, Jake and I attended court-mandated counseling sessions in an attempt to salvage our marriage. The therapist tried to get us to see each other's perspectives, but it felt like an uphill battle. Jake was convinced that I had overreacted and that I should have just let the whole incident with Buddy go. My mother made a mistake, but she's still family, he insisted. You had no right to take legal action against her. I, on the other hand, felt vindicated by the judge's ruling and saw no reason to apologize for protecting my family. Your mother committed a crime, Jake, I argued. She could have killed Buddy, and who knows what she might have done next if left unchecked. The counseling sessions often ended in stalemates, with neither of us willing to budge from our entrenched positions. I began to wonder if our marriage was even salvageable at this point. In the months that followed, the emotional toll of the ordeal became increasingly difficult to bear. Jake and I were like two strangers living under the same roof, barely speaking to each other unless absolutely necessary. Our daughter, now 4 years old, was the one who suffered the most. She was constantly caught in the crossfire of our tense silences and occasional explosive arguments. I could see the confusion and sadness in her eyes, and it broke my heart. I knew that I had to make a decision, either try to repair my marriage for the sake of our daughter, or start considering the possibility of separation. As much as I loved Jake, I couldn't keep subjecting our child to this toxic environment. After much soul-searching, I decided that it was time to explore the option of divorce. As painful as it was, I knew that it might be the healthiest choice for everyone involved. Looking back on this entire ordeal, I can't help but feel a mix of sadness, anger, and ultimately, relief. Sadness for the breakdown of my marriage and the fracturing of our once happy family. Anger at Jake's unwavering loyalty to his parents, even after their despicable actions. And relief that I had the courage to stand up for myself and my loved ones, even when it meant making incredibly difficult choices. Divorcing Jake was one of the hardest decisions I've ever had to make, but I know in my heart that it was the right thing to do. Our daughter deserves to grow up in a loving, stable environment, free from the toxicity and drama that plagued our marriage. As for Sophia and Robert, I've cut them out of our lives completely. They've made no attempts to apologize or take responsibility for their actions, and I have no desire to ever let them back into our lives. They had their chance, and they blew it in the most egregious way possible. Moving forward, my focus is on creating a happy, healthy life for myself and my daughter. We've been through so much, but we've come out the other side stronger and more resilient. And while the road ahead may not be easy, I know that we'll be okay, because we have each other, and that's all that really matters.